The Subcommittee on Technology and Innovation will come to order. Good morning. Welcome to today's hearing entitled Assembling the Facts, Examining the Proposed National Network for Manufacturing Innovation. In front of you are packets containing the written testimony, biography, and truth and testimony disclosure for today's witness. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. U.S. manufacturing's global market share has held steady at around 20% for nearly the last 30 years and still represents the largest manufacturing sector in the world. In my home state of Arizona, manufacturing contributes approximately $20 billion to our economy. Almost 60% of all U.S. exports are in manufactured goods. Though there are some areas in decline, contrary to popular belief, the manufacturing sector is far from vanishing. Technology has the potential to continue dramatically changing the sector. Both the skills needed by workers and the number of workers necessary could look very different from the assembly lines of the past. Innovative processes such as additive manufacturing, which enable low-volume, adaptable production, are transforming the future of manufacturing. We don't make it easy for manufacturers in the United States. While all of our major global competitors have been lowering their corporate tax rate, ours has been essentially unchanged for the past 20 years and is now the highest in the industrialized world. Rising costs in healthcare, environmental compliance, and litigation all discourage manufacturing from thriving domestically. According to the Manufacturing Institute, U.S. industry is faced with the highest pollution abatement costs compared to its major trading partners, even higher than the so-called green economies of Western Europe. In the first 3 years of the Obama administration, the federal government has imposed 106 new regulations with annual costs of more than $46 billion. When we are discussing manufacturing and innovation, the conversation is really about the conditions that create a better business environment. Yet rather than focusing on these issues, the administration has again chosen to create a new $1 billion program the details of which have yet to be provided to Congress. Today we will examine the proposed National Network of Manufacturing Innovation. The proposed network would create up to 15 centers around the country focused on different areas of advanced manufacturing. During the current fiscal year, the administration has also moved forward with a pilot institute supported by up to $45 million in fiscal year 2012 funds from multiple agencies, including 3 within this committee's jurisdiction: NIST, NSF, and the Department of Energy. I firmly believe that manufacturing is important to our economy and innovation, but I am troubled by the continued reliance on politically driven research and development. I think that the best thing we can do to help domestic manufacturers is to trust our markets and reduce the cost of doing business in the United States. I look forward to hearing more about the proposed NNMI, and I hope that today's conversation helps to provide more detail for members of the subcommittee as to why the administration believes this initiative is necessary. We thank Undersecretary Gallagher for being here today, and we look forward to your testimony. I want to now recognize the ranking member, Ms. Edwards, for her opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you so much for holding today's hearing to examine the proposed National Network for Manufacturing Innovation. I'd also like to thank Dr. Gallagher. It's good to see you again, for being here this morning and for your leadership both at NIST and as part of the administration's current efforts to revitalize American manufacturing. Although we've heard time and time again in this committee about the crucial link between economic growth and a vibrant U.S. manufacturing sector, I think it bears repeating. American manufacturing employs more than 11 million Americans in high-paying jobs. As recently as 2010, manufacturing contributed $1.7 trillion to the nation's economy and accounted for 60% of all U.S. exports. Manufacturers account for nearly 2/3 of U.S. investment in research and development. And for every manufacturing job we create, we add 5 additional jobs along the supply chain. And for every dollar in manufacturing value added, we create $1.40 in new value in other sectors. Advanced manufacturing is also expected to create even more jobs. In fact, a study by the Milken Institute has shown that every job created in electronic computer manufacturing generated an additional 15 jobs. And finally, innovation in U.S. manufacturing enables our companies to develop new technologies and new products and helps keep the United States competitive. Simply put, made in America equals American jobs and a strong economy. Unfortunately, this committee has also heard the United States' competitive edge in manufacturing has slipped. And according to the Council on Competitiveness, the United States ranks 4th in global manufacturing competitiveness and expected to fall to 5th place in just 5 years. Countries such as Korea, Japan, and Germany have a larger share of the advanced manufacturing sector than the United States. If we do nothing and settle for the status quo, our position will almost certainly decline further and our economy will continue to struggle. Thankfully, the administration has renewed its commitment to American manufacturing and is focused on ensuring that the United States is the global leader in advanced manufacturing. The truth is that the perception of manufacturing as low-skilled assembly line work is outdated and no longer applies. The future of manufacturing is, in fact, advanced manufacturing, a high-tech endeavor that uses sensors, robotics, and cutting-edge modeling and simulation. Biomanufacturing and nanomanufacturing processes are and will be conducted by high-skilled and highly trained technicians in lab-like environments. If we want to create high-paying jobs and help this country keep its competitive edge, then we need to move forward with policies and programs that will expand and support the development of advanced manufacturing. One such proposal, the National Network for Manufacturing Innovation, or NNMI, we're all going to get confused about that, is the topic of today's hearing. The purpose of the proposed NNMI program is to establish up to 15 public-private manufacturing institutes across the country. These institutes will serve as centers for manufacturing excellence that will accelerate innovation in manufacturing and help transition cutting-edge manufacturing technologies from the lab to the marketplace. As I understand it, the NNMI is modeled after the successful Fraunhofer Institutes in Germany. And Germany has been able to withstand the global financial crisis in large part due to its focus on innovative technologies as a key driver to economic growth. The Fraunhofer Institutes are widely considered to be a central and key component of the country's effective high-tech strategy. Based on Germany's success, a number of organizations, including the Council on Competitiveness, the Manufacturing Institute at the National Association of Manufacturers, the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, and the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation have all called for the establishment of a similar network of public-private manufacturing centers in the United States to accelerate the development and deployment of advanced manufacturing technologies. I believe the concept has significant merit, and I'm excited by the administration's proposal. I'm eager to learn today more about how NIST and the administration plan to execute this initiative. And I'm specifically interested in learning how the proposed Additive Manufacturing Pilot Institute will be structured and how it will be coordinated with the broader network to ensure that lessons learned will be applied. I'm also looking forward to learning more about how the interagency partners are working together to make this network a reality. Certainly the challenges facing U.S. manufacturers are urgent. The truth is that we simply can't afford to wait. If we're committed to a vibrant manufacturing sector and to improving our competitive position in advanced manufacturing, it's precisely the time for bold ideas and devoted leadership. I look forward to working with Dr. Gallagher, the chairman, and my colleagues on implementing this initiative and ensuring that it's effective and successful. Thanks again, Mr. Chairman, for calling this important oversight hearing, and I yield the balance of my time.
Thank you, Ms. Edwards. If there are other members who wish to submit additional opening statements, your statements will be added to the record at this point. This time, I'd like to introduce our witness. Dr. Patrick Gallagher is the Undersecretary of Commerce for Standards and Technology and the Director of the National Institute of Standards and Technology. Thanks for being here this morning. As our witness should know, spoken testimony is limited to 5 minutes. After presenting your spoken testimony, members of the committee will have 5 minutes each to ask questions. I now recognize our witness, Dr. Patrick Gallagher, for 5 minutes.
Great. Thank you very much, Chairman Quayle and Ranking Member Edwards and the members of the committee. It's a privilege for me to be here and have the opportunity to talk about the administration's proposed National Network for Manufacturing Innovation. I appreciate this opportunity to update you because there's been a lot of progress on implementing the President and the Secretary's vision to ensure U.S. basic and applied research and development is optimally leveraged to benefit U.S. industry. Manufacturing matters, Mr. Chairman. As the President has said, an economy built to last demands that we keep doing everything we can to keep strengthening American manufacturing. A manufacturing strategy for the 21st century should focus on making the industrial sector globally competitive. That's a quote from the American Enterprise Institute, and we agree. A robust manufacturing sector is in everyone's interest and of importance in everyone's district. The administration and NIST are critical partners in this effort and have been hard at work on this issue. The stage was set last summer in a report on advanced manufacturing by the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, PCAST. And it reminded us why manufacturing remains essential. Manufacturing that is based on new technologies can provide high-quality, good-paying jobs for American workers. It's critical to our balance of trade. It represents 60% of U.S. exports, and it drives technological innovation, accounting for some 70% of private sector research and development activity in the economy. The report also made it clear that the government should play an important role through the development of an innovation policy as opposed to an industrial policy, and the difference is crucial. Given the breadth of manufacturing, the report looked at a broad range of approaches to help sustain and grow the sector. In addition to research and development, the report looked at areas such as tax, trade, workforce, regulations, small business, and education policies, and how they either can help or hinder the health of the manufacturing sector. Another consequence of a focus on manufacturing is the importance of an effective interface between the public and private sectors. And because of this, when the PCAST report was released in June of last year, the President also announced the formation of the Advanced Manufacturing Partnership, whose purpose is to bring together industry, universities, and the federal government to work together to invest in the emerging technologies that will create high-quality manufacturing jobs and enhance our global competitiveness. To complement the public-private partnership, the administration also strengthened the interagency coordination on advanced manufacturing, and in that context, NIST was asked to play a key role. In February, the National Science and Technology Council, it had an interagency working group on advanced manufacturing, and it issued a report that said that the acceleration of innovation for advanced manufacturing requires bridging a number of gaps in the present U.S. innovation system, particularly the gap between research and development activities and the deployment of technological innovations in the domestic production of goods. And other organizations ranging from the Information Technology Innovation Foundation to major U.S. companies such as Dow and GE have each expressed their support of an approach to address these gaps in a strategic and targeted way. The NNMI is the administration's approach to meeting the challenges of addressing these gaps. The President's proposed network would create up to 15 institutes for manufacturing innovation, or IMIs, around the country. And these IMIs would bring together industry, universities, community colleges, federal agencies, regional and state organizations, all working together to accelerate innovation by investing in industrially relevant manufacturing technologies with broad applications. The President also announced that the administration will take immediate steps to launch a pilot demonstrating an Institute for Manufacturing Innovation, but based on existing programs within the Departments of Defense, and potentially also including the Energy, Commerce Departments, NASA, and the National Science Foundation. These are two distinct efforts, but have an important relationship between them, and I'd like to briefly expand on this. The NNMI program has not yet begun. It will require legislation enacted to fund and carry out this program. And currently, the administration is working on the requirements or principles of that legislation to support congressional efforts on a potential bill. And I am looking forward to working with this committee on that effort. The principles outline the basic features of the NNMI program that would be established under competitive grants through the program. And we are working on developing these principles with extensive input from our agency partners and from the private sector through a series of regional meetings and through a request for public information, and importantly through the pilot. The pilot program that the President announced is a way for us to demonstrate the concept of multiple agency, industry, and academic consortia jointly executing a single program. That's the essence of these institutes. And it is really a demonstration effort based entirely on existing programs within the participating agencies. There's much we will learn through the process of standing up an institute with our federal partners and enable us to use those lessons to benefit the eventual design of the NNMI. It's an area that cuts across different agency missions, and each agency brings their own expertise. NIST has been asked to play a critical role in both its interagency capacity and because of its mission. Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gallagher. I want to remind members the committee rules limit questioning to 5 minutes. The chair will at this point open the round of questions, and I recognize myself for 5 minutes. Dr. Gallagher, I agree with you in terms of the importance of manufacturing to our economy, to our exports, to providing good, high-paying jobs here in the United States. But one of my concerns is with the focus, especially on policy basis, of just specifically to the manufacturing sector. You know, why shouldn't we just be focusing on broader applications, broader policy decisions that affect all businesses. I don't think I'm alone in this. I think Christina Romer, in a recent article, stated that they're not seeing any specific market failures within the manufacturing sector. We should be focusing on policy decisions that affect all businesses so they can be successful and they can grow and they can expand. What do you see that's different, that is a special need for the manufacturing sector, especially seeing that we haven't lost out, we've been holding steady in manufacturing since 1980?
Forgot my button. So that's a great question. It's actually central to almost every policy discussion we end up having about manufacturing. And in fact, recently, Gene Sperling, the President's lead economic advisor within the White House, had a speech about this, talking about the role of government in manufacturing-related activities, and actually made the observation this is a place where otherwise like-minded economists can even disagree. And I think it stems from a natural discomfort to talking about any one sector in the economy and the issue of broad-based policy. But the PCAST report actually laid out a compelling reason why we need to actually take a look at manufacturing, even if we don't have manufacturing-specific policy solutions. And I agree with you. A big part of this is laying out the general conditions for business, of which manufacturing is part of, and making sure that in that context we have a business climate, whether that's through tax, trade, regulation, so forth, that's as supportive as possible, because these businesses are competing in very robust, globally competitive markets. And that's clearly part of the administration's policy focus as well, and it was outlined in the NSTC report. The interesting thing about manufacturing, though, is it plays a couple of unique roles as a sector. Some of them have been long-standing policy areas. One is how it supports our national defense capabilities. And the need for domestic manufacturing capacity is, in fact, entwined with our ability to secure and protect our country. Additionally, the manufacturing sector is rather unique in how it interfaces with our nation's capacity to innovate. Most of the R&D investments and performance in this country is not done by the federal government. It's done by the private sector. And 70% of that private sector activity is in manufacturing-based activities. So it plays a disproportionate role. And in fact, and that's one of the reasons these public-private partnership issues are automatically brought up in manufacturing, because on one end, as a country, we support through public investments, basic research, even applied research. In some areas where there's an overriding mission need, like in defense or energy and others, we go farther. But there has to be an effective transition of this know-how to the private sector if it's going to reap the full economic benefit to the country.
Okay, you bring up some interesting points. And looking at what the administration, they've devoted a significant amount of resources to manufacturing activities at many different federal agencies. For example, just this week, the administration announced that the Advanced Manufacturing Jobs and Innovation Accelerator Challenge, which is a multi-agency $26 million effort to assist the development and implementation of regionally driven economic development strategies that support advanced manufacturing and cluster development. So I'm trying to figure out what I'm missing here, because this sounds really similar to it is difficult, Ms. Edwards, NMI. So what am I missing? How is this different? Are we putting just more redundancy, more overlapping programs that are trying to actually have the same goals and accomplish the same goals?
Only to the extent that there's a number of programs that touch on manufacturing, but the programs themselves are quite different. So the interesting thing about manufacturing from a federal policy perspective is that it's a big enough and a diverse enough set of activities that it touches federal programs in a number of ways. It'll touch workforce, it touches training and education, it touches innovation, it touches economic development, small business support. One of the focus points has been, how do you bring disparate, different federal efforts into alignment so that you can have greater synergy? And that was certainly the focus of the announcement this week, to look at a regional manufacturing strategy. Another theme that came up as we talked to industries across the country, that's the point of integration. That's where everything comes together. That's where a company and its supply chains and the educational infrastructure and the small business support, the banking industry, the VC funding, everything needs to be in place to have this whole greater than the sum of the parts effect. And so the announcement in that context was, how do you bring different programs into alignment so you have that larger effect? The NNMI is basically, very simply, it's about creating shared R&D infrastructure. It's a place where different companies can work together alongside national lab and university researchers to effectively bridge this gap between one part of the research community that's largely operating on public funding and one set of institutes and a set of organizations that are all private sector funded that are working in different business institutes. And so that's basically what the NNMI is. It's shared R&D infrastructure.
Okay, thank you very much. Now I recognize Ms. Edwards for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I would note that I guess Dr. Gallagher has been saying NNMI for a long time because it seems to roll off your tongue. Before I begin my questions, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to include a few items in today's hearing record. The first is a statement from the Council on Competitiveness outlining some of its recommendations for revitalizing manufacturing in the United States and expressing support for the National Network for Manufacturing Innovation proposal. The second, as you may be aware, late last year, the Manufacturing Institute, that's the education and services arm of the National Association of Manufacturers, and EWI jointly developed a proposal to establish a network of advanced manufacturing application centers across the country, similar actually to what's being proposed in NNMI. And I'd like to submit the PowerPoint presentation that was delivered by EWI and the Manufacturing Institute just this past December that clearly articulates the need for these centers and outlines a critical role for the federal government in providing support for the network. In fact, in the submission, the manufacturing applications centers point specifically to capital equipment and core capabilities funded by the federal government, essentially recommending 20% of that kind of funding balanced by competitively bid programs. And I'd like to note that yesterday, EWI's CEO specifically encouraged its member companies to get behind the Obama administration's NNMI proposal. And the third item I'd like to introduce for the record is a press release from the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation applauding the NNMI. And in the press release, the Foundation's president, Rob Atkinson, claims that the NNMI is, quote, one of the most important steps this or any administration has taken in recent years to revitalize American manufacturing, end quote. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to add those to the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. And then to Dr. Gallagher, in your testimony, as we've heard time and time again, manufacturing is closely tied to competitive and innovative capacity of our nation. Undoubtedly, manufacturing creates well-paying jobs and is key to our economic growth. What's less clear is what gap or need NIST is trying to fill through the establishment of the National Network for Manufacturing Innovation. And so I wonder if you could describe the need that the network will attempt to address.
Thank you very much. So the gap in the R&D cycle that's being looked at is basically between an area where we're quite comfortable with public investment, largely at universities or national labs, where we're looking at basic or early applied research, very clearly pre-competitive, and it's performed and funded in very different ways than another sector, which is very late-stage technological development performed by individual companies through their own funds. What we're concerned about is that there's both almost no programs in the middle bridging those two, and the degree of segregation between those two groups of participants is in fact grown wider. It's grown wider by shifts in funding both on the federal side in terms of the balance between applied and basic R&D, and it's also become a larger gap in terms of the nature of what private industry funds. And so the answer appears to be creating a vehicle where companies can leverage each other. In other words, pool the risk and address, because we want to move the private sector into the earlier stage research to begin to form that. And we also want to put it in a place where the folks doing the early stage research have access, and so you're creating a mixing zone. So it's really trying to address this very important gap between two very different communities, and that's And that's one of the reasons I believe that we're hearing such broad support from across industry, from across academia, and from across all these associations, that this type of entity is really quite important.
Thank you, Dr. Gallagher. And I wonder if you could share with us, because I think a lot of us have questions about this, given that NIST is historically focused mostly on intramural research. In addition to the funding level that is proposed for the program, it really dwarfs NIST's entire current annual budget. Can you explain why NIST is the best equipped to oversee the implementation of the network?
So it's a great question. You know, since prior to the late 1980s, NIST was all intramural, you're correct, and the addition of intramural programs largely came in the late 1980s. So NIST does have some experience running these programs. One thing to emphasize, though, is that the NNMI is envisioned as built-in a multi-agency effort. This is really not about giving NIST a unique program. This is designed to support, because manufacturing supports a wide variety of agencies. This ability to act in concert and bring a spectrum of efforts and looking at manufacturing from the Defense Department, from the Energy Department, from NASA, from National Science Foundation, and NIST is critically important. That being said, from a clear accountability perspective, it was viewed as while we will build in strong interagency vehicles to make this work as a multi-agency effort, somebody has to basically be on the hot seat for making sure this is done right. And in particular, since the idea is to have a network, something that links these different entities together so that, again, there's a whole greater than the sum of the parts and an ability to disseminate best practice. NIST has tremendous experience in networking manufacturing-related activities together. That's really what MEP is. We've had experience in running these types of programs, and I think the consensus from the interagency community was that it really made the most sense for NIST, because of its broad mission to support the competitiveness of U.S. manufacturing, was the natural sort of home. But this really is done through a multi-agency effort.
Thank you. My time has expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Edwards. And now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Smith, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Gallagher, first of all, let me thank you for the good work you have been doing, particularly in regard to scientific research and developing standards. I think NIST has done an outstanding job in those areas, and you get the credit. However, in regard to NNMI, I wish the administration were more interested in creating jobs the old-fashioned way, which is to say either lowering taxes or keep taxes low. That encourages businesses to invest and produce and create jobs that way, and also in reducing the burden of regulations on small business or any business as far as that goes. As you know, this administration has broken all kind of records with its proposed regulations. I think over 200 in 2011 alone, each of which would cost businesses over $100 million. And here we have President Obama twice publicly, I think first in a State of the Union address and second during an address to a joint session of Congress, talking about the need to reduce the burden of these stifling regulations on businesses. We've heard the words, and yet his actions contradict those words. And so, like I say, I wish this administration were more committed to creating jobs by reducing regulations and keeping taxes low. And I hope this NNMI initiative is not just another example or a smaller version, for instance, of the stimulus plan, $800 billion there, which we saw did not work, did not keep unemployment below 8%. And in fact, even the president admitted there were very few shovel-ready jobs created and very few jobs created as a result. In this case, you've come out with a one-time only, one-year mandatory spending of $1 billion. I don't know why we expect this to be any better or to perform any better than other stimulus plans that the administration has advanced that have not particularly worked. But, and I think this follows up on a question you were asked earlier, why isn't we haven't seen any specific legislative language in regard to the NNMI program? And when are we going to see that language?
Thank you very much. So let me focus on the why is this one time and what's the path forward?
Well, actually, if you'll answer that last question first, then you can go back to that. But why haven't we seen language, and when are we going to see language specifically proposed by the administration?
Very good. So The administration did not intend to send over a ready-to-enact piece of legislation. The reason being for that is we believe that the best vehicle to do this would be to come up with a legislative proposal that can have broad bipartisan support.
Okay. Who is going to write that, or who are the people working on that?
Well, I think we're hoping that that effort would be led from the Hill, and that we would work with any interested committees that would be willing to do that, including this one.
Has the administration approached any congressional leaders yet? And if so, who have they approached?
The approach has been, the administrative strategy has been led by the White House, and I'm sure they've had discussion with manufacturing caucus-related groups. I don't have a list of who they've specifically talked to at this point. From my perspective, we've been talking with everyone who has expressed an interest and has wanted to talk to about the proposals. And the NIST focus has been to try to outline those parts of the program that would be required to be defined in legislation that would make these institutes function effectively. The issues of how to identify the cost, the outlays, and the offsets is not something that within NIST we've been specifically focused on.
Okay, that not specifically focused on worries me a little bit. When you had the administration propose a new program, and you can't say who they've talked to in Congress, and you can't say specifically where the money is going to come from, that begins to look more and more like a political election year eve initiative that is not really serious or is not conceived to be a piece of legislation that will actually pass. Do you understand why we might think that when you can't say who you've approached and you can't give us any specifics?
I can see why we'd say that, but I have to say it's my failure to communicate effectively, not a signal of the administration's intent and priority to this program. I think our goal would be to find a vehicle, a piece of legislation with as broad a support as possible. I don't think this is being done for any political.
I'm sure the congressional leaders would welcome that approach when and if it occurs. And can you tell us again where that likely source of the $1 billion might be, since it's going to be redirected from other programs? What other specific programs will be cut?
So my understanding is that the administration's 2013 budget had identified a number of potential offsets.
You mentioned that a while ago, but you can't tell us specifically where those offsets are?
No, I think there were several $100 million worth of offsets that were identified, was my understanding, and I, at this point, could not do that, but I'd be happy to follow up with you.
Okay. I hope you will follow up where the specific offsets might occur, what language. Surely the administration's legislative shop has some specific ideas, but until they come up with the specifics, I think I'm slightly skeptical about how serious the administration is. Thank you, Dr. Gallagher.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. At this point, I'd actually like to ask unanimous consent to put into the record a recent article in the USA Today by Dan Ikenson regarding various policies to help the manufacturing sector and the broad business sector. Without objection, it will be included as part of the record. Now, I would like to go to recognize Ms. Bonamici from Oregon for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dr. Gallagher, thank you so much for being here today to talk about the importance of manufacturing and the critical role that we can play at the federal level to support innovation in manufacturing. I know last week was Small Business Week, and I spent the district work period touring small businesses across Northwest Oregon. And the topic of manufacturing and innovation naturally came up often, as it's directly related to small business job growth and job creation in my district. I was in Astoria, Oregon. I had a great discussion with a small business that was recently able to start canning their own product, allowing them to sell their product throughout the Northwest. I'm proud to share this example with my colleagues here today. There are a number of efforts and opportunities in place that seek to leverage federal resources through partnerships with state and private sector stakeholders to boost manufacturing. Dr. Gallagher, can you share with us how the proposed National Network for Manufacturing Innovation, as part of the comprehensive manufacturing innovation strategy, will help small businesses like the one in my district continue to grow?
Delighted to, and I appreciate your comments and observations about the MEP program in Oregon. That's great to hear. So there's a couple of overlaps between interactions between the existing MEP program and the NNMI. The NNMI, as I said, is really about creating shared research capacity. One of the interesting developments is that we tend to think of industrial R&D as largely based out of big companies. That is not true anymore. The small and mid-sized manufacturers have become centerpieces of innovation in manufacturing technology, process, new materials. And that's particularly true in emerging technology areas. So one of the things that we envision is that the NNMIs, the institutes created under this program, would be specifically designed to foster and incorporate small business participation, small manufacturing participation. And one of the ways that they can provide that outreach is by creating partnerships with the local MEP programs, which are already networks to tens of thousands of local manufacturers from across the country. So you have an existing network that's working with existing small businesses and supporting their competitiveness, including looking at diversification, introduction of new technologies, supporting to trade. And we're talking about a network of research capacity which brings together companies and academia to work on enabling technology. These two networks, of course, can feed off each other, and that's probably the biggest synergy between these two programs. In fact, the concept of a network to disseminate not only best practice between the institutes, but to have sort of shared metrics so that as these institutes evolve, they grow and develop in a way that's most supportive of their goals, something we learned from MEP.
Thank you very much. And also we know that in order to maintain a strong manufacturing base in this country, we need to develop advanced manufacturing technologies, processes, and materials. But we also need to develop a highly skilled workforce that's capable of filling the high technology manufacturing jobs of the future. Can you explain how workforce development will be incorporated into the National Network for Manufacturing Innovation programs?
Yes, I can. So I think the interaction with workforce, which as you point out is one of the key themes that comes up when we talk to every manufacturing entity, really has sort of two aspects to it. As a shared R&D infrastructure, and manufacturing employs some 70% of the private sector researchers, engineers, and scientists in the United States. There's a direct tie with that type of workforce development. This is a venue for bringing in top research talent, working on industrially identified and relevant programs, and it creates clear pathways to that workforce need. But the other interaction is a more indirect one, that these institutes are expected to be magnets for co-location, for synergies between the manufacturing activity itself and the R&D activities, including technical scale-up. So we envision technical and vocational training programs, including community colleges, that there will be opportunities, the knowledge creation that's happening at these institutes to support broader workforce training programs in these regions that would be around these institutes.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Bonamici. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Holgren, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Dr. Gallagher. I'm confused about the purpose of the institutes. The administration website states that they may conduct basic and applied research, but I know other documentation suggests that the institutes will focus on applied research in order to scale up new technologies in the U.S. This definitely would squarely place such work outside the basic research domain. Which is it?
Both. So the intent is to have the institute program is designed to stand up and form these institutes where you can have mixed, you can bridge this gap between basic and applied and between much more developmental activities. So the institutes themselves need to support a broad range of research activities. I think one of the key questions you're raising is where's the federal funding going? The federal funding for those research activities would be done on a project-by-project basis. So it would certainly be appropriate for some project being done maybe at the institute to be supported by federal funding if it was in appropriate basic or applied window. But if it's really out in an area that's getting closer to technology development for a particular company, we do not envision that to be something that would be publicly funded. In fact, One of the major objectives of these institutes is that they create a venue, a vehicle that's attractive for increasing investment in R&D by companies.
Would there be a check on that? Because, I mean, I really do think a time like this when resources are so tight, I'm a strong proponent of supporting basic scientific research, but it's really that application where the private sector has shown an ability and a willingness to do it. How are we going to make sure that we're not spending federal dollars on, in an area that we shouldn't be?
So, you know, there's two tensions here. The way I think this will play out in practice is through the actual cooperative agreements that cover project-specific activities. And that's how we will ensure that, you know, federally funding doesn't go for something that's inappropriate. There's going to be a mixture of activities in these institutes, and that can't be a recipe for inappropriately mixing funding against what it was purposed for. That being said, you know, you're raising this important issue, which is in tight times we focus to mission unique, and the government provides basic research, and that's part of what's been driving the strong segregation of participation. So we're fighting. You're exactly right. You don't want inappropriate funding, but you also still need to create a vehicle where that proximity and that technical interaction can continue to occur, and that's kind of the key question.
Well, I do wonder, and kind of going to the next point, you know, would we really need such direct support for manufacturing, applied research and development? Would it even be necessary, you know, if government intervention was directed instead at reducing general taxes, regulatory burdens that really are hindering American companies? I wonder if there's another way at getting this accomplished rather than some of the direct support.
So I'm going to, you know, my take on that would be there's two issues here. One is I would agree with you entirely that for manufacturing to be competitive, we have to do all of these things. It's not enough to simply have access to good ideas and technology if you can't compete and sell it in a global market. No question. The institutes are a piece of a larger puzzle, and the piece that they're after is making sure that the transfer of knowledge is as efficient as possible between the investments we do make as a country in basic and applied research and what we hope to be their commercial use in manufacturing. That gap is real, and I think even doing things like lowering R&D, increasing the R&D tax credit and things of that type, while it supports efforts by individual companies to enhance and grow their research investments, the missing issue is how to get them to work in longer intermediate range research where individual companies have been reluctant to make those longer term commitments. And we believe that by working together in these type of shared research institutes and this type of shared research infrastructure that you facilitate that because they leverage each other's investment. And that's really the idea both behind consortia and behind the call for this type of infrastructure.
My time is running low, but if I can try and get one more very specific funding question. Information on the fiscal year 2012 funding for the Pilot Institute has been unclear as to the total amount of funding available and which agencies are supporting the pilot financially. In some cases, at least $45 million has been posted, while in other, up to $45 million. I wonder if you could please clarify briefly the amount that has already or will be spent from fiscal year 2012 funds on the pilot and which agency funds are being used.
So the quickest way for me to give you the full breakdown will be to share a table with you afterwards, which I'm happy to do.
Great, thank you.
But it is up to 45. The amount that's part of the joint call, which is part of a joint solicitation that's being carried out by the Defense Department, NSF, NASA, and DOE, is 30. And then what we've identified is once the institute is established, it would be a likely candidate for additional funds on a competitive basis, and that's where the up to comes from. But I think the table will answer your question most succinctly.
Okay, good. Thanks, Dr. Gallagher. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Holker. And the chair now recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Lipinski, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Dr. Gallagher for your work and for your testimony. I certainly think the NNMI is at its root a very good, important concept, and I think you've been doing a good job of explaining why that is. I think one of the things that we really have to look at is we invest a tremendous amount in research. The federal government invests a lot in research. And right now, one of the biggest barriers to advanced manufacturing commercialization is that the development of new technologies are sometimes too risky or too long-term for industry to develop on its own. And that's what it sounds like to me, what you're aiming at doing here. I have pushed the federal government to develop a national manufacturing strategy. We're actually having a hearing in Energy and Commerce tomorrow on a bill I have to implement a national manufacturing strategy. I've also championed programs like one that just began at the NSF called the Innovation Corps, which helps to teach researchers how to commercialize research that they have had funded already by the federal government. So I think the NNMI certainly can help, but obviously we need to work through these things. I'm looking forward to working with you to figure out how exactly we're going to implement the NNMI. It's my understanding from your written testimony this model has been successfully deployed in other countries. You've looked at that. I know the Fraunhofer Institutes in Germany is one example. I know a lot of their funding, much of their funding, comes from doing contract research. This is not something that you had mentioned, or at least I hadn't noted it. Do you anticipate that that will be part of this initiative?
I think the answer is yes. The development of a stable business model for these institutes is going to be something that will need to be played out in the solicitation, review, and award process for this program. We envision this as a one-time investment, with the government playing this convening and coordination role and allowing some time for the private sector entities that are going to work together in these institutes to develop the vehicles for a sustainable business model. The way it is played out in many countries is a combination between support to the institute, this what I would call a base funding to keep the institute's overall functions working, and the research activities that are covered on a project-by-project basis. So you can call that contract or grant or cooperative agreement, but there would be a specific funding. And I think that's probably going to be the case here just because of the diversity of types of research that are going to be done there, and addressing the need to make sure that federal funding is used for the purposes of federal funding, and private sector funding that's brought in is used for purposes that the companies want to use it for. So I think you're right. This is a shared infrastructure, and there will have to be some base funding of some type, probably through some collective action on the part of the key participants, whether it's membership fee, whether it's consortia type program, I don't know. We envision no long-term role for the federal government supporting that, and then a collection of project-specific or contract-type work that would cover the different types of research efforts underneath the Institute. That seems like a realistic assumption to make on how a possible business model will go. This is, by the way, the subject of questions under the request for information that's ongoing now.
Well, obviously, a lot of things that we have to work out in this, but I want to take the last minute to ask one other question. What can be done as we develop this initiative to ensure that we're not just helping the Chinese to build better iPads? What steps can we take to make sure the products developed from work at the NNMI are commercialized here in America?
So one part of my answer would be we should build these institutes, because to not do it is actually enabling foreign competition to reap the very open and diverse output that we have from our basic and applied research, simply because we're not taking steps to nurture that next stage, which is the translation of that know-how and knowledge into the commercial sector. So I would argue right now we actually do disadvantage ourselves by basically doing one part of it, publishing it wide open, and then stopping and not providing vehicles for the efficient translation into companies.
I agree with that, but the iPad was really developed here, but now it's all being manufactured overseas.
And so this points to this synergy that happens between the actual manufacturing activity and the innovation. The reason these are physical institutes for research development around manufacturing is to support and drive this co-location synergy. We would want to see manufacturing and their suppliers and this ecosystem being built around these activities. That's the best thing we can do to ensure that the know-how that we generate in this country is translated into the actual maximum economic benefit by producing, selling, and making these commercial products. A good example of that is what's happening in Albany, New York in the nanotechnology arena, where this shared research capacity looking at this emerging area of nanomanufacturing is driving very strong attraction by other companies to want to be located near that to reap the benefits of both the knowledge that's being created and the talented researchers in that area. And so I think we're doing a lot in that case. That region is doing a lot to capture as much as possible that knowledge and ensure that we benefit from it.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Lipinski. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Krivak, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate being recognized, but since I just came in from another committee meeting, I'd like to yield my time to Mr. Palazzo.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Krivak, for doing so. Dr. Gallagher, thank you for being here today. As I see it, you're coming in, or the administration is requesting $1 billion, and I've tried to review everything, and what I keep coming back to is I'd much rather spend $1 billion on roads and bridges, or possibly even $1 billion into the NASA heavy lift program. But with all that being said, I would like to say a couple, provide a statement for you, and I think it will be pretty clear. You may have heard some of these questions earlier. But Thomas D. Hopkins, a researcher for the Small Business Administration, said in his report, a survey of regulatory burdens, compliance with regulation imposes burdens on businesses for which they receive no explicit benefits or compensation. The National Association of Manufacturers asserts that their industry is at a significant competitive disadvantage in the global marketplace as a result of the corporate tax rate in America, which is the highest among developed nations. Also, a recent Small Business Administration study showed that U.S. manufacturers bear a $162 billion annual burden to comply with federal regulations. These are dollars manufacturers are not spending on capital investment or hiring new workers. So, I mean, you're asking for a one-time investment of $1 billion, but as a former small business owner and a CPA, I mean, I would be trying to remove these hurdles to job creation and American competitiveness before I invested $1 billion. And so with that, in the face of the uncertain future of taxation and the regulatory environment on manufacturers in America, what is the NMI going to do to reduce these burdens on U.S. manufacturers?
So I would agree with you that in manufacturing we have what I call a chain of performance problem, that all of these things have to work in concert. And I'm actually in agreement with you that we have to look at the business condition that these companies are operating in, including the tax rate the President's proposal. We agree. We have to lower the corporate tax rate for these businesses. We want to provide incentives for them to do research and development. We have to address trade promotion, make sure the barriers are down so they can sell into global markets. We have to make sure they have access. So one of the challenges we will face in working together on manufacturing is that it always brings up a very broad spectrum of issues, and they really have to work in concert. The NNMI is really about one type of barrier that they face, and the barrier is access to the ideas and the talent that are the new products that they're going to make. And we've seen this. It's quite compelling that the manufacturing sector's competitiveness is tied to being at the cutting edge of these emerging technology areas. And if there's barriers there and our companies are at a disadvantage in harnessing the know-how that's being created by our scientists, by our engineers, by innovators and entrepreneurs, then that's a different type of barrier. It may play out on a different time scale than immediate barriers like certain types of tax issues or regulation, but it's a barrier nonetheless. And that's going to be a challenge, and I think that's why we want to work with you across a portfolio of programs. But this NNMI won't solve all of these different issues, and it's not intended to. It's designed to address this one barrier that we're concerned about, which is this growing valley of death, if you will, between basic public sector funded research and the private sector development.
Well, so basically you agreed with me on being overtaxed and overregulated. And again, it just comes back. If I had $1 billion and I was going to invest in a company and they had internal control problems, fiscal problems, I would want them to clean those problems up before I took that kind of an American investment, which is not my money to give. It's the American taxpayers. It's the people who get up every day, go to work to put food on their table, to provide the best education for their children and provide a home, safe transportation. And I would expect if they were in here, they would be demanding some governmental reforms, like a lower corporate tax rate, removing these obstacles to job creation, and possibly addressing just the frivolous litigation in our society. The three of the greatest things, many of them generated by from former Congresses that are basically providing that wet blanket in our economy, because I do believe the manufacturers, if we just unshackle them, they would be able to go out and compete globally, and they will fill any need that we need them to fill. So thank you for your time. Mr. Chairman, thank you. I yield back.
Claiming my time, I'll yield back to the chair.
Thank you. Are you, Mr. Crack, do you have any questions? Are you ready?
If there are no more questions and my time allows, I'll be glad to answer
Mr.
questions.
Palazzo, I recognize you for 5 minutes. Do you want to yield to Mr. Kravac?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have to leave, so I would love to yield my 5 minutes to Mr. Kravac.
I just love parliamentary procedures. Thank you, Dr. Gallagher, for being here today. And thank you for addressing some of these very important issues. We are a manufacturing giant. We just have to unleash the entrepreneurial spirit which is in this great country. It's always been in this country. And Mr. Palazzo hit right on the head in regards to there's two things that when I talk to manufacturers, there's two things they talk about: taxation and regulation. Those are the two main proponents that they talk about. So with that said, I want to invest in making sure that we have a return on this investment. Understand getting $1 billion, but I want to make sure at the end of the 5 years we have a result for of that investment. So can you tell me how you're planning to move this forward after 5 years so we don't see you again in 5 years asking for another $1 billion?
Yes, I think the way we would like to do this is make the development of a sustainable business model for these institutes. This is really about the private sector being able to work together to cover this gap.
When you say a sustainable business model, you've said that a couple times. How can you produce a sustainable business model with innovation, of course, making more efficient, better productivity, understand that. But until we get to the true root cause of why companies go overseas, which is taxation and regulation, is that going to be part of your paradigm?
Well, look, as I said, we agree that the taxation regulation is part of creating a competitive business environment. There's no disagreement there. But the reasons companies go overseas, and there's been a number of recent surveys that have looked at this, are actually broader than just the taxation regulation or labor cost issues. Those are clearly drivers, but one of them is that they're following capacity. And in other words, if you look at what's happening in R&D investment by companies overseas, it is growing much faster overseas than it is growing in this country. And it's growing specifically in those areas where the manufacturing sector is growing. So it's Asia, the Asia 8 or the Asia 10, or where all the R&D growth is occurring. So what's happening in Asia is they're actually using the synergy between manufacturing and research to build their research capacity. They're working it the other way. They first come in with an advantage of relatively cheap labor, and they build their way and move up the value chain until they're building research capacity. And then what happens is you get this synergy effect where it's easier for a company to, or they may make a decision just because we've hollowed out a capacity in the U.S. that for those reasons, access to talent, access to that they move there. And that's really what these are about addressing, is we don't want to lose that capacity to translate the knowledge that we're creating into U.S.-based companies and let them profit from that. And what will happen, of course, is you're right. If from a business perspective, you're looking at short-term cost, and those conditions matter. I don't disagree with you. But there's also strong evidence that you can make a decision that makes sense on the short term, where you decide to offshore something because it's cheaper to make that product. And what we find now is that you've actually lost the capacity to generate the next generation product. And that's a long-term trade-off you really, that we're trying to address here.
Thank you. We've talked a little bit about the public-private partnership and the co-investment from participating entities. Is it expected from applicants there's going to be funding of an in-kind match? Is there a minimum investment? Who's going to invest? How much are they going to invest as part of this partnership?
So our goal in doing these is to maximize the private sector investment in the institutes, and that would be both an evaluative criteria in evaluating these proposals. It's even true in the pilot that there's been stated an expectation they would like to see at least 50% match in terms of the participants. And in addition, we want to see that match change over time. In other words, we'd like the federal government to not have a mortgage, a long-term role in supporting these. We're trying to support the creation of these institutes where you can have shared activity among companies and then be able to get out. And that's happened before. The semiconductor industry and the auto industries, where the government played a very important convening role to set these up, has been able to back out over time, and those companies and sectors continue to enjoy very strong interactions across companies and have very strong applied research activity. So that's the goal here.
If the chairman just indulge me just a little bit, do we have these private sector entities, have they been identified? And have they had a commitment?
For the pilot?
For the pilot.
So the pilot right now is basically undergoing a call. There was an industry day or proposers day that was hosted by the Defense Department a couple of weeks ago. I understand there were at least 20 potential groups that were looking at forming these, and that's under a very abbreviated call. I think it was only 30 or 40 days or something of that type. So the interest appears to be exceedingly high. That would be my early read.
Thank you, Dr. Gallagher. I appreciate your time, and I'll yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kravac. I thank Dr. Gallagher for his valuable testimony today and the members for their question. The members of the subcommittee may have additional questions for the witness, and we'll ask you to respond to those in writing. The record will remain open for 2 weeks for additional comments and statements from members. The witness is excused. Thank you all for coming. This hearing is now adjourned.